I first noticed something was wrong when my cattle started clustering around the old watering hole. The spring that had fed my family's farm for 4 generations was running at barely a trickle, and the clear water that had never failed us was now reduced to a muddy seep. My great-grandfather had chosen this land specifically because of the natural spring that bubbled up from the limestone bedrock, providing a reliable source of fresh water even during the worst droughts. The spring had been the foundation of our farming operation, feeding our livestock, irrigating our crops, and supplying water to our farmhouse. I followed the dry creek bed upstream, walking the familiar path I'd taken countless times as a child. What I found made my blood boil. Where the spring had once emerged from a grove of ancient oak trees, I now saw construction equipment, concrete foundations, and the skeletal frames of what would soon become expensive houses. The Riverside Meadows development had been under construction for 6 months, but I hadn't paid much attention to the details of their building plans. My property sat downhill from the development site, and I had assumed that the construction wouldn't affect my water supply. I was wrong. The developers had built directly over the underground aquifer that fed my spring, installing foundations, septic systems, and utility lines that disrupted the natural flow of groundwater. Worse yet, they had diverted the spring's flow to supply their own development, essentially stealing the water that had belonged to my family for generations. I stood there in the construction zone, watching workers install pipes that would carry my spring water to fill swimming pools and water-manicured lawns in houses that cost more than most people in a decade. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were using my water to create an artificial paradise while destroying the natural ecosystem that had sustained my farm. A construction supervisor approached me, his hard hat gleaming in the afternoon sun. "You can't be here, sir. This is a private construction site. I'm looking for my spring," I replied, pointing to the concrete foundation that had been poured directly over the source. "It's been feeding my farm for over a century." The supervisor shrugged. "Take it up with the HOA. We're just following the approved plans." I walked back to my farm, my mind racing with anger and determination. They had taken my water without permission, without compensation, and apparently without any concern for the consequences. But they had made one critical mistake. They didn't understand who really owned the spring. Chapter 2. Understanding the Rights. That evening, I dug through the old wooden filing cabinet where my father had kept all the important farm documents. Among the yellowed papers and faded photographs, I found what I was looking for: the original deed to our property, signed by my great-grandfather in 1923. The deed was remarkably detailed for its time, describing not just the surface boundaries of our land, but also the underground water rights. In clear legal language, it granted my family exclusive ownership of all springs, streams, and underground water sources originating within the described property boundary. The spring that fed the Riverside Meadows development originated on my land, about 200 feet uphill from where it emerged from the ground. The underground stream flowed through limestone caverns beneath my property, before surfacing in the grove of oak trees that the developers had now buried under concrete. I called my lawyer, Jim Crawford, who had handled legal matters for our family for 20 years. Jim was a local attorney who understood both property law and the agricultural heritage of our community. "This is a clear case of water theft," Jim said, after reviewing the documents I'd brought to his office. "They can't just divert a spring that originates on your property, regardless of where it surfaces." Jim explained that water rights in our state followed the rule of capture, which meant that property owners had the right to use groundwater that originated beneath their land. Since the spring originated on my property, I had the legal right to control its flow, even if it surfaced elsewhere. "The question is, what you want to do about it," Jim continued. "We can file for an injunction to stop their water usage, or we can demand compensation for the water they've already taken." I thought about the construction supervisor's dismissive attitude and the way the developers had proceeded without even consulting me about the water rights. They had assumed that a small-time farmer wouldn't have the knowledge or resources to fight back. "I want to shut them down. They took my water without permission. Now they can figure out how to get their own." Jim smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. Let me draft a cease and desist letter, and then we'll see how quickly they want to negotiate." The letter was sent by certified mail the next morning, demanding that the Riverside Meadows HOA immediately stop using water from my spring and restore the natural flow to my property. We gave them 72 hours to comply before taking legal action. I didn't expect them to cooperate, but I wanted to give them a chance to do the right thing before I played my trump card. Chapter 3. The Arrogant Response. The HOA's response came faster than I expected, but not in the form I had hoped for. Instead of a reasonable discussion about water rights, I received a visit from their lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Bradley Morrison, who drove up to my farmhouse in a luxury sedan that probably cost more than my annual income. Morrison stepped carefully around the mud puddles in my driveway, clearly uncomfortable in his expensive shoes and tailored suit. He looked around my farm with the kind of disdain that city people often showed for rural properties. "Mr. Henderson," he said, extending a manicured hand that had obviously never done manual labor, "I represent the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. I understand you have some concerns about water usage in our development." "Concerns?" I replied, wiping my hands on my work jeans before shaking his hand. "Your people stole my spring. That's not a concern. That's theft." Morrison smiled condescendingly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. The water source in question is located on property that was legally purchased and developed according to all applicable regulations. The HOA has every right to use water found on their property." I pulled out a copy of my deed and the survey map that showed the spring's origin point. "The spring starts on my land. Your fancy houses are just where it comes to the surface." Morrison barely glanced at the documents. "Property law is complex, Mr. Henderson. I'm sure your local attorney has done his best, but water rights require specialized expertise. My firm has handled dozens of similar cases." His patronizing tone was starting to get under my skin. "And what's your expert opinion?" "The HOA is prepared to offer you a one-time payment of $5,000 to resolve any potential claims you might have regarding the water source. It's a generous offer, considering that you have no legal standing to interfere with our development." $5,000 for water rights that were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to their development. The offer was so insulting that I almost laughed. "What if I refuse your generous offer?" I asked. Morrison's smile disappeared. "Then you'll find yourself in a very expensive legal battle against a well-funded HOA with excellent legal representation. These cases can drag on for years and cost more than most farmers can afford." The threat was clear. Take the money or be crushed by legal expenses. It was the kind of bullying tactic that probably worked on most people who couldn't afford to fight back. "I'll consider your offer," I said, knowing that I had no intention of accepting it. Morrison handed me his business card. "You have 48 hours to decide. After that, the offer is withdrawn, and we proceed with our own legal action." As he drove away, I realized that the HOA had no intention of negotiating in good faith. They were counting on their superior financial resources to intimidate me into submission. They were about to learn that some things were more valuable than money. Chapter 4. The Engineering Solution. After Morrison's visit, I spent the evening walking my property and studying the natural flow of water across the land. The spring originated from a limestone cave system that ran beneath the eastern section of my farm, emerging at several points before converging into the main flow that the developers had diverted. My great-grandfather had been a practical man who understood the importance of controlling water flow. When he first settled the land, he had built a simple but effective system of channels and gates that allowed him to direct spring water to different parts of the farm, depending on seasonal needs. The original control system was still there, hidden beneath decades of overgrowth and largely forgotten since we had installed modern irrigation equipment, but the basic infrastructure remained intact. A series of stone channels and wooden gates that could redirect the spring's flow away from the development and back to its natural course through my property. I called my neighbor, Pete Williams, who ran a small excavation business and had helped me with farm projects over the years. Pete was a practical man who understood both the technical and legal aspects of what I was planning. "You want to shut off their water supply?" Pete asked after I explained the situation. "I want to restore the natural flow to my property. The water belongs to me. They can figure out their own water source." Pete grinned. "I like it. How long do you think it'll take them to notice?" "Their wells are shallow and depend entirely on the spring flow," I said. "I'm guessing 3 days, maybe less." We spent the next morning clearing the overgrown channels and repairing the old gate system. The work was straightforward but labor-intensive, requiring us to move rocks, clear debris, and rebuild sections of stone channeling that collapsed over the years. By afternoon, we had restored the original water control system to working condition. The main gate was positioned at the point where the spring flow could be directed either toward the development or back through the natural course across my property. "You sure about this?" Pete asked as we prepared to close the gate that would cut off the flow to Riverside Meadows. I thought about Morrison's condescending attitude, the construction supervisor's dismissal, and the way the HOA had simply taken my water without permission or compensation. They had shown no respect for my property rights or my family's heritage. "I'm sure," I said, and turned the wheel that closed the gate. The effect was immediate. Within minutes, the flow of water toward the development slowed to a trickle, and then stopped completely. The spring water that had been stolen from my farm was now flowing back through its natural course, filling the creek beds and watering holes that had been dry for months. My cattle seemed to sense the change, moving toward the restored watering holes with obvious relief. The land itself seemed to exhale as the natural water cycle was restored. Now, all I had to do was wait. Chapter 5. The First Day. The first sign of trouble came early the next morning when I noticed several cars driving slowly past my farm. their occupants staring at my property with obvious confusion. Word was apparently spreading through the Riverside Meadows development that something was wrong with their water supply. I went about my normal morning routine, feeding the cattle and checking on the crops, but I kept an eye on the activity in the development. By mid-morning, I could see people gathering in small groups, pointing toward my property and having animated discussions. Around noon, a white pickup truck with Riverside Meadows Maintenance painted on the side pulled into my driveway. The driver was a middle-aged man in work clothes who looked genuinely puzzled rather than, "Excuse me, sir," he said, approaching me with his hat in his hand. "I'm Dave Martinez, the maintenance supervisor for the development. We're having some kind of problem with our water system, and I was wondering if you'd noticed anything unusual." I appreciated his polite approach, which was a stark contrast to the treatment I'd received from the HOA lawyer and construction supervisor. "What kind of problem?" "Our wells started running dry yesterday afternoon," Dave explained. "All 22 houses are affected. The water pressure dropped to almost nothing, and now most of the taps are completely dry." "That's strange," I said, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Have you checked for broken pipes or equipment failure?" "That's the thing. All our equipment is working fine. It's like the water source just disappeared. I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Dave seemed like a decent man who was just trying to do his job, but I wasn't ready to reveal my role in the water shortage. "Maybe it's a seasonal thing. We've had some dry weather lately." "Maybe," Dave said, but he didn't sound convinced. "The thing is, your property seems to have plenty of water. Your creek is running higher than I've seen it in months." I shrugged. "We've always been lucky with our water supply. My great-grandfather chose this land specifically because of the spring." Dave thanked me for my time and drove away, but I could see him looking back at my property with a thoughtful expression. He was clearly starting to put the pieces together. By evening, the situation in the development was becoming more serious. I could see residents carrying water bottles and jugs from their cars, and several houses had portable toilets being. The lack of water was affecting not just drinking and cooking but also basic sanitation. I felt a twinge of sympathy for the residents who were suffering because of their HOA's arrogance. But I reminded myself that they had benefited from stolen water for months, without questioning where it came from. The HOA board was about to learn that water rights weren't just abstract legal concepts. They were real, practical issues that could bring a $1 million development to its knees in a matter of days. Chapter 6. Escalating Pressure. By the second day, the situation in Riverside Meadows had escalated from inconvenience to crisis. I watched from my porch as water trucks arrived to supply the development, their drivers struggling to navigate the narrow streets designed for luxury cars rather than commercial vehicles. The HOA had apparently hired an emergency water service to provide temporary relief, but the cost was astronomical. Each truck could only supply a limited amount of water, and with 22 houses requiring water for drinking, cooking, and basic sanitation, the trucks were making multiple trips per day. I received another visit from Dave Martinez, the maintenance supervisor, but this time he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a woman in business attire who introduced herself as Patricia Wells, the HOA president. Wells was clearly frustrated and trying hard to maintain her composure. "Mr. Henderson, we need to discuss the water situation affecting our community." "I'm sorry to hear you're having problems," I replied. "Have you contacted the county water department?" "We've contacted everyone," Wells said, her voice tight with stress. "The county says our wells should be fine. The water company says there's no problem with the municipal supply. But our entire development has been without water for 36 hours. Dave spoke up. "Mr. Henderson, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. You mentioned that your great-grandfather chose this land because of the spring. Where exactly is that spring located?" I could see where this was heading, but I decided to play along. "It's up in the oak grove, or at least it used to be before your construction." Wells's eyes widened. "Are you saying our development was built over your spring?" "I'm saying your development was built over the place where my spring used to emerge," I corrected. "The spring itself originates on my property." The implications of this statement hit Wells immediately. "Are you claiming ownership of our water source?" I pulled out a copy of my deed and handed it to her. "I'm not claiming anything. I own the spring. It's been in my family for 4 generations. Wells studied the deed with growing alarm. "This can't be right. Our lawyers assured us that all water rights issues had been resolved." "Your lawyers were wrong," I said simply. Dave was looking back and forth between Wells and me with obvious concern. "Ma'am, if Mr. Henderson owns the spring, and we've been using his water without permission, we need to call Bradley Morrison immediately," Wells said, pulling out her phone. I watched as Wells made a frantic call to the HOA's lawyer, her voice becoming more agitated as the conversation progressed. When she hung up, her face was pale. "Morrison says he needs to research the water rights issue," she told Dave. "In the meantime, we need to continue with the emergency water service." "Mrs. Wells," Dave said quietly, "at the current rate, The emergency water is costing us over $3,000 per day. The HOA reserves won't last more than a week. Wells turned back to me with desperation in her eyes. Mr. Henderson, surely we can work out some kind of arrangement. Our residents are suffering. I'm open to discussions, but first, your lawyer needs to acknowledge that I own the water rights. Then we can talk about terms. As they drove away, I could see Wells on her phone again, probably calling an emergency board meeting. The HOA was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. The third day brought a parade of visitors to my farm, each more desperate than the last. The water crisis in Riverside Meadows had reached a breaking point, with residents threatening to sue the HOA and local news crews arriving to cover the story. The first visitor was Bradley Morrison, the HOA's lawyer, who arrived looking considerably less confident than during his previous visit. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his usual arrogant demeanor had been replaced by obvious anxiety. "Mr. Henderson," Morrison began, "I've reviewed the water rights documentation, and it appears there may be some validity to your claims." "Some validity?" I replied. "Either I own the spring or I don't. Which is it?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "The legal situation is complex, but yes, it appears you have legitimate water rights that predate our development." It was the first time Morrison had acknowledged my legal position, and I could see how much it pained him to admit he'd been wrong. "What are you proposing?" I asked. "The HOA is prepared to offer you $50,000 for a permanent easement to use the spring water," Morrison said. "It's a substantial increase from our previous offer." $50,000 was a significant amount of money, but it was still far less than the water rights were actually worth. More importantly, it would legitimize the HOA's theft of my water and set a precedent for future abuse. "Not interested," I said. Morrison's composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Henderson, you need to be reasonable. 22 families are without water. There are children and elderly residents who are suffering because of your actions." "My actions?" I replied, feeling my own anger rising. "I didn't steal anyone's water. I didn't build houses over someone else's spring. I simply restored the natural flow of water across my own property. But you're deliberately causing harm to innocent people. I'm exercising my legal rights on my own property. If that causes problems for your development, maybe you should have done better research before building." Morrison left without making any progress, but he was quickly replaced by Patricia Wells and 2 other HOA board members. They looked like they hadn't slept in days, and their usual polished appearance had been replaced by obvious stress. "Mr. Henderson," Wells began, "our residents are talking about abandoning their homes. Property values are plummeting. We're facing a complete disaster." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I genuinely was. The residents were paying the price for their board's arrogance and incompetence. "What will it take to resolve this situation?" asked a man who introduced himself as the HOA treasurer. "First, you need to acknowledge that you stole my water without permission," I said. "Second, you need to compensate me for the water you've already used. Third, we need to negotiate a fair agreement for future water use." "How much compensation are we talking about?" the treasurer asked nervously. I had done some research on water rights valuations and had a number in mind. $200,000 for past usage, plus monthly payments for future access. The board members exchanged glances of shock and dismay. It was clear that the HOA didn't have that kind of money available. "We'll need to discuss this with our residents," Wells said finally. As they left, I could hear them arguing among themselves about how to handle the crisis. The HOA was finally learning that their actions had consequences. Chapter 8. Media Attention. The water crisis at Riverside Meadows had attracted the attention of local news media, and by the 4th day, reporters were camping outside the development and requesting interviews with anyone involved in the dispute. I initially tried to avoid the media attention, preferring to let my lawyer handle any public statements. But when Channel 7's investigative reporter Jennifer Walsh showed up at my farm, I decided to tell my side of the story. "This is really about property rights and corporate responsibility," I explained during the on-camera interview. "A development company built over my family's spring without permission and has been stealing our water for months. When I asked them to stop, they threatened to sue me." Jennifer was clearly sympathetic to my position. "How long has your family owned this spring?" "4 generations. My great-grandfather settled here in 1923, specifically because of the reliable water source. It's been the foundation of our farming operation ever since." The interview aired that evening and generated an enormous response from viewers. The story resonated with people who understood the importance of property rights and were outraged by the HOA's behavior. The media coverage also attracted the attention of environmental groups who were concerned about the broader implications of the case. A representative from the State Water Conservation Alliance contacted me to offer support for my position. "This case highlights the importance of protecting natural water sources from inappropriate development," said Dr. Sarah Chen, the Alliance's director. When developers disrupt natural water systems, it affects entire ecosystems and surrounding properties. The environmental angle added another dimension to the story and increased pressure on the HOA to find a reasonable solution. They were no longer just dealing with a property dispute. They were facing criticism for environmental destruction and corporate overreach. The negative publicity was also affecting property values in the development. Real estate agents reported that several houses had been withdrawn from the market, and potential buyers were canceling contracts due to concerns about the water supply. The HOA board was facing pressure from multiple directions: angry residents, mounting legal costs, environmental criticism, and a collapsing real estate market. The crisis that had started with stolen water was now threatening the entire development. Patricia Wells called me that evening, her voice strained with exhaustion. "Mr. Henderson, we need to meet. The board is ready to discuss your terms." "I'm listening," I said. "Can we meet tomorrow morning? We're prepared to make a serious offer." I agreed to the meeting, knowing that the HOA was finally ready to negotiate in good faith. The pressure had become too great for them to continue their arrogant stance. The next morning would bring either a reasonable settlement or the complete collapse of their development. Either way, justice would be served. Chapter 9. The Negotiation. The negotiation meeting took place in the conference room of Jim Crawford's law office, with both sides represented by their attorneys. The HOA board looked defeated before the discussions even began, their earlier arrogance replaced by desperate pragmatism. Bradley Morrison had been replaced by a new lawyer, a woman named Susan Taylor, who specialized in water rights disputes. Her presence indicated that the HOA was finally taking the legal issues seriously. "My clients acknowledge that Mr. Henderson has legitimate water rights that were not properly addressed during the development process," Taylor began. "We're here to negotiate a fair resolution that serves everyone's interests." It was a complete reversal from Morrison's earlier position, and I could see the relief on Jim Crawford's face. We had won the legal argument. Now it was just a matter of working out the details. "The HOA is prepared to offer $250,000 in compensation for past water usage," Taylor continued. "We're also willing to pay monthly fees for continued access to the spring." The offer was higher than my initial demand, reflecting the HOA's desperation to resolve the crisis quickly. But I was more interested in the long-term arrangement than the immediate payment. "What kind of monthly fees are you proposing?" Jim asked. $5,000 per month, with annual increases tied to inflation," Taylor replied. I did some quick calculations in my head. The monthly payments would provide a steady income stream that could support my farming operation for years to come. More importantly, the arrangement would give me ongoing leverage to ensure that the HOA respected my property rights. "There are some conditions," I said. "First, the HOA must acknowledge in writing that they improperly used my water without permission. Second, they must agree to environmental protections that preserve the natural spring system. Third, they must pay for any future damage to my property caused by their development." Taylor took notes as I outlined my conditions. "Those terms seem reasonable. Is there anything else?" "Yes. If the HOA ever fails to make the monthly payments or violates any of the environmental protections, I have the right to immediately shut off the water flow." The HOA board members exchanged nervous glances. They understood that this condition would give me permanent leverage over their development. "We need to discuss this with our residents," Patricia Wells said. "The monthly payments will require a significant increase in HOA fees." "That's your problem," I replied. "You created this situation by stealing my water. Now you need to figure out how to pay for it legally." The meeting adjourned with an agreement to finalize the details within 48 hours. The HOA needed time to secure financing and get approval from their residents, while I needed time to review the environmental protections with experts. As we left the law office, Jim Crawford smiled with satisfaction. "That's one of the most complete victories I've ever seen in a property rights case. You not only got your water back, but you're going to be compensated fairly for their theft." I felt a sense of justice being served, but also a recognition that the real victory was in establishing a precedent that would protect other property owners from similar abuse. The HOA had learned an expensive lesson about respecting water rights and property boundaries. Chapter 10. Resolution and Restoration. The final agreement was signed 1 week later, with the HOA accepting all of my conditions and agreeing to the financial terms we had negotiated. The $250,000 compensation payment was transferred to my account, and the first monthly payment of $5,000 was made immediately. More importantly, the agreement included comprehensive environmental protections that would preserve the natural spring system for future generations. The HOA was required to remove any construction materials that interfered with the underground water flow and to maintain buffer zones around the spring emergence points. The restoration of water flow to the development was accomplished gradually, allowing the HOA to test their systems and ensure that everything was working properly. Within 3 days, all 22 houses had full water pressure restored, and the emergency water trucks were no longer needed. The residents of Riverside Meadows had mixed reactions to the settlement. Some were angry about the increased HOA fees that would be needed to pay for the water rights, while others were relieved that the crisis was over and their property values were stabilized. Several residents approached me personally to apologize for their board's behavior and to express appreciation for my willingness to restore their water supply. Many of them had been unaware of the water rights issues and were shocked to learn that their homes had been built over stolen water. "We never would have bought here if we'd known about the legal problems," said one resident, a retired teacher named Margaret Foster. "The board should have disclosed these issues before we invested our life savings." The media coverage of the settlement was generally positive, with most outlets portraying the case as a victory for property rights and environmental protection. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of proper due diligence in development projects. The environmental groups that had supported my case used the settlement as an example of how property owners could protect natural resources from inappropriate development. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Water Conservation Alliance praised the agreement's environmental protections. "This case shows that individual property owners can make a real difference in protecting our natural water systems," she said. "Mr. Henderson's courage in standing up to a powerful HOA has created protections that will benefit the entire watershed. The financial benefits of the settlement allowed me to make significant improvements to my farming operation. I invested in new irrigation equipment, expanded my sustainable farming practices, and established a college scholarship fund for local students studying agriculture or environmental science. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the resolution was the restoration of the natural water flow across my property. The creek beds that had been dry for months were now running full again, and the wildlife that depended on the spring was returning to. My cattle had access to abundant fresh water, my crops were thriving with improved irrigation, and the land itself seemed to be healing from the disruption caused by the development." Chapter 11. Lasting Legacy. 2 years have passed since the water rights settlement, and the monthly payments from the HOA have provided financial stability that has transformed my farming operation. The steady income stream has allowed me to focus on long-term improvements rather than just surviving from season to season. The environmental protections included in the agreement have had positive effects that extend far beyond my property. The restored natural water flow has improved the health of the entire watershed, benefiting wildlife and vegetation throughout the area. I've worked with environmental scientists to monitor the spring system and document the recovery of the natural ecosystem. The data we've collected has been used to support similar cases in other parts of the state, helping other property owners protect their water rights. The case has also led to changes in state law regarding water rights disclosure in development projects. Developers are now required to conduct comprehensive water rights surveys and disclose any potential conflicts to prospective buyers. The Riverside Meadows development has stabilized under new management, with a board that takes environmental stewardship seriously. They've implemented water conservation measures and have worked cooperatively with me to maintain the spring system. Several of the original board members, including Patricia Wells, resigned in the aftermath of the water crisis. The new board has adopted policies that emphasize transparency and community cooperation, rather than the adversarial approach that created the original problem. My relationship with the development residents has improved significantly. Many of them have become supporters of agricultural preservation and environmental protection, understanding how their community's prosperity depends on maintaining healthy, natural systems. I've established educational programs that bring school groups to my farm to learn about water conservation and sustainable agriculture. The spring that was once stolen has become a teaching tool for the next generation of environmental stewards. The monthly payments from the HOA have also allowed me to expand my farming operation and implement innovative conservation practices. I've become a regional leader in sustainable agriculture, demonstrating that environmental protection and economic prosperity can go hand in hand. Looking back on the water rights battle, I'm proud that I stood up for my family's heritage and property rights. The fight wasn't just about money, it was about establishing principles that will protect rural communities and natural resources for future generations. The spring continues to flow across my property, providing life-giving water to my farm and the surrounding ecosystem. It serves as a reminder that some things are too valuable to be stolen, and that standing up for what's right can create lasting positive change. My great-grandfather chose this land because of its water, and now that water will continue to sustain my family and community for generations to come. Sometimes the best victories are the ones that protect what we've always had, rather than gaining something new. The red barn still stands beside the flowing creek, and the cattle still gather at the spring-fed watering hole, just as they have for 4 generations. The land endures, the water flows, and justice has been served. Thank you for listening to this story of standing up for water rights and fighting corporate overreach. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in courtroom, but in our own backyards. defending the natural resources that sustain our community. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I love hearing from people all around the world who understand the importance of protecting our water and standing up to those who would steal what belongs to us all. And if you enjoyed this tale of a farmer using the power of nature and property law to bring an arrogant HOA to its knees, please subscribe to our channel for more stories about environmental justice, David versus Goliath victories, and the power of never backing down when you know you're right. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue sharing these important stories with people everywhere.